A preschool class was asked to draw a picture of what they wanted to be when they grew up. And one little girl was having a hard time with this, and so the teacher walked over to see what her problem was, and she finally exclaimed with some exasperation, she said, "I want to be married, but I don't know how to draw it." Well, have you ever felt like that little girl about marriage? You want a sound and solid and stable relationship, but you're not 100% sure what that means or exactly what that might look like. I've thought a lot about that the past 52 years since my wife and I have been married. I've had opportunities through the years to preach on it, to counsel couples that have come to me with marital challenges. And there are a lot of things that we could say tonight about the secrets of marriage. But I call the 7 secrets of a satisfying marriage. Sure is good to have everyone back tonight, and I hope you had a pleasant afternoon and that you're back tonight to take notes. Everybody's picked up their sermon notes. And I hope that not only will you jot down the answers to the fill in the blanks, but I hope that I will say something that will cause you to write down some other things. In other words, what you think as a result of what I say. Something that you want to work on to improve in your own relationship. Something maybe you want to share with somebody else. Or something that spurs you to give some further thought and study to this grand topic. We appreciate the way in which we have been received and the kindness that you've already expressed to us in a number of ways. And it's good to be with you and look forward to the rest of the week together. Well, the first secret we want to talk about tonight, I call the commitment to the relationship of marriage. And if you're going to have a successful marriage, a satisfying, fulfilling marriage, it must begin with a commitment to marriage. Now, what God says about this, ladies and gentlemen, is extremely simple. The Old Testament tells us in Malachi chapter 2 and in verse 16 that God hates divorce. Now, I recognize this day and age that in the size of this audience, there's probably someone here that is divorced and maybe someone that is divorced and remarried. And what I'm about to say is certainly not to cast aspersions upon you personally. But I'm just simply pointing out what God says about this and that He hates divorce. And I'm going to make a statement that I think I can back up by that whenever there's a divorce, there's been sin. Now, I recognize, I read this morning from Matthew 19. In fact, we're going to notice it again here where Jesus said in verse 6, what God had joined together, let not man separate. And Jesus gives a scriptural exception to this idea of one man for one woman for life. And certainly in the case of sexual immorality, there is a scriptural right to put away a spouse. But right there you have sin, don't you? And so I'm just saying that regardless of who's at fault or what is going on, that when there's a divorce, there's been sin on someone's part or even both parties' part. And thus God is not pleased with the idea of us having to have a divorce. When you think about the idea of commitment, a lot of people don't seem to understand what commitment is all about. You know, commitment is a willingness for us to be unhappy until we can work. We live in an age today where everyone wants immediate gratification. And I've had people tell me, well, Ken, I'm not happy with her, or I'm not happy with him. And so therefore, because I'm unhappy, then I need to find me somebody else. I need to get out of this relationship. I was preaching a number of years ago in a congregation in Tennessee, and we developed there within the congregation something that shocked all of us. I had no clue of it. There were 2 couples in the congregation got to running around together, and they were going up to Nashville to Wild Horse Saloon and line dancing, doing all kinds of stuff they probably shouldn't have been doing in the first place. But the wife of the one couple got close to the husband of the other couple. Both couples Christians, all four of them Christians now. And the next thing we knew, they were having an illicit relationship. And to kind of compound my shock to this, the young lady was the church secretary. And she would come in 3 days a week and work for me and do some work that the elders would give her. Seemed like the sweetest, nicest, most godly young lady. Had absolutely no clue that any of this was going on. Well, as soon as the elders got wind of this, they went to see them, and she had already left her husband. He had left his wife. They moved in together somewhere. And in an elders meeting, the elders were talking about this, and they repeated in my presence what he said. He said that his wife, that he was scripturally married to, he was unhappy with her. And he pointed to the wife of the other man that he had taken, and he said, she makes me happy. And he said this, I think God wants me to be happy. Now, doesn't that just justify everything right there? You're unhappy in a relationship. You find someone that makes you happy. You decide God wants you to be happy, and so you just go off with someone else. Well, I don't find that anywhere in my Bible. And so that's why I say, if you're having marital problems and you're unhappy, I'm sorry you're unhappy, and the Lord is sorry you're unhappy, but you need to have a commitment to the relationship of marriage and be willing to be unhappy for a while until you can figure out a way to work this out. See, God's ideal for your relationship, whether you're married or not, or even if you're married, you want to get out of this, is harmony and intimacy and love and unity. And the reality is that in a lot of our relationships, there is disharmony and there is conflict and there is disappointment. Like one fellow said, he said, I feel cheated in my marriage. I feel cheated by my relationships. He said, when I got married, I started off with an ideal. In a few months, it turned into an ordeal. Now, he said, I'm looking for a new deal. And that's the notion that a lot of folks have. Good marriages don't just happen. They take energy, and they take effort, and they take a lot of work. Our marriage is what we make it to be. See, a lot of folks think the grass is greener on the other side. You've heard that expression, haven't you? Especially here in the Bluegrass State, right? The grass is greener on the other side. You know where the grass is greener? The grass is greener where you water it. And if people would work harder at watering the relationship that they're in, then the grass would be greener there. So that's the first place that we need to begin if you're going to have a good, satisfying marriage. Committed to the relationship of marriage and what we talked about this morning. Now, if you're here tonight and you missed this morning's lesson, I recommend you go back, especially the first lesson, because in it we laid out what the Bible is marriage. And we talked about the principles and precepts, the foundation on which we're basing this entire series. The second secret of a satisfying marriage is a communication of thoughts. And the problem is that in a lot of relationships, there is very poor communication. One of the survey found that the average couple only talks to each other 4 minutes a day. Now, that's a little hard to believe, but that's what the survey showed. I mean, that's 28 minutes a week. That's not very much communication. You know, sometimes we're kind of like the couple that were with some of their friends, and the subject of marriage counseling came up, and Mary said, oh, Tom and I will never need counseling. We have a great relationship. He was a communications major in college, and I majored in drama. He communicates really well, and I just pretend like I'm listening. Well, that's what I said about it too, okay? That's not going to work if you're going to have a good relationship. And you know this 28 minutes that I mentioned in that survey, that is compared to other surveys that shows the average couple watches 46 hours of television a week as a couple. Now again, that's hard for me to believe it's that many hours. So maybe what they need to do, those couples, is turn off the television a little bit and spend some time talking with one another. Let me share with you some biblical principles of communication that will help you. And I wish we had the entire time just to talk about this one point. The first thing is to tell the truth. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 25 says, "Therefore put away lying, and let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another." You know, I mentioned to you this morning, folks, that I think a lot of times we look at Bible principles or Bible passages in a vacuum. And we look at a passage like this, well, this is just talking about our Christian life or talking about his brethren. Well, wait a minute, isn't your home your Christian life? Wouldn't this passage apply to your home? To put away lying and speak the truth? But the problem is a lot of couples are living a lie. And a lot of couples are not telling each other the truth. Now, I've counseled with couples sometimes, and I will say to him when he comes to me about his problem, or to her, "Have you told her how you feel?" He said, I can't do it. I can't do it. He said, "I'm afraid the truth will hurt her too much." Well, you know what? I'll tell you this. Sometimes the truth hurts. It does. You know what hurts worse than the truth? A lie. It will every single time. And when couples come to me and they're hiding something, not being honest with each other, I tell them, you've got to fess up. And no matter how painful that is, no matter how temporarily disruptive it may be, no matter what hurt or heartache it may engender in your wife or your children, whatever, you've got to tell the truth. Either that or we just need to cut this passage out of the Bible and decide it didn't apply to our marriages. Well, the second thing, though, about telling the truth is this, that we say it kindly. That we speak the truth in a kind way and with love. In Ephesians chapter 4 and down about verse 29 and then down through 32, he says, no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification. And then he says in verse 32, and be kind to one another. And so while we speak the truth, we don't have to speak the truth in an abrasive way, in an unkind way, in a cruel way, in a cutting way, in a harsh way, in a hurtful way. That we speak the truth is set up in verse 16 of that chapter, speaking the truth in love. Be kind to one another as you speak the truth. A third thing is to avoid anger. Proverbs 15 and verse 1 says, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. This is such a pervasive and prevalent problem in homes that I'm going to take a whole lesson one night and talk about it. And I forget if that's Wednesday night or Thursday night, but one of those nights, and you got it in your notes there, that we're going to take a whole lesson and talk about the issue and the problem of anger. But you're not going to have good communication, because I'll just tell you this right now in case you don't make it back that night or something. But what happens when one person gets angry, you just communication to your spouse. I mean, if I say things and my spouse blows up and goes ballistic over it and gets so angry that hurtful things are said, why would I want to communicate if all it's going to engender is anger? And so anger just shuts off communication as quick as it can be. Well, then the third principle I would suggest here in communication would be encouraging words. Learn to speak words of encouragement, words that build, words that lift up. Again, the wise man, Proverbs 16:24, says, pleasant words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the bones. Or in chapter 12, and verse 25, he said, heaviness is in the heart of man. Heaviness in the heart of man makes it stoop, but a good word makes it glad. And so look for ways to encourage one another, to praise one another, to build one another up. Don't be the person in your marriage that is always harping on something, that is always critical, that always is pointing out the flaws of your spouse and the problems and the things you don't like. Look for the things that build up, the things that encourage, and the things that are praiseworthy. And then the fifth principle I would share is learn to listen. James 1 and verse 19 tells us to be slow to be angry, but to be quick to listen. Slow to speak, quick to listen. Learn to listen. Now, you know what my natural tendency is? My natural tendency is to be slow to listen, but quick to speak. Am I the only one here that's that way? That we're quick sometimes to shoot from the hip and to say something instead of being slow to speak. I think that's a great principle of communication in every relationship. Be slow to speak, be very quick to listen. Learn to listen. Communication also involves your feelings and your hopes and your dreams and your vision. Dr. Paul Faulkner, in talking about the importance of communication in his book, Whatever Family Needs, says this: communication is to love what blood is to the body. When communication stops, love begins to die. And that's right. And it doesn't happen overnight necessarily. But I think Faulkner is right. Love begins to die when communication stops. A third secret I would suggest is the consideration of feelings, of being considerate of one another's feelings. Now, what that means is to pay attention, not just to what your spouse is saying or your children are saying or your parents are saying, but to pay attention to what they're feeling, of showing common courtesy, of showing regard and being thoughtful of their feelings. You see, guys, what this means is to wait till she has both legs in the car before you take off. See, that's a good thing to do. It means bringing in the groceries for her even when it's late in the second half and UK is down by 1 point. That's what you have the pause button for, you see. That's what you have TiVo for on your television. To do that and to bring in the groceries. And I say, what's the matter with you? Can't you see the ball game is on? They're about ready to score. Well, when that happens, you're not scoring. See? So that's consideration of feelings. Let me give you a couple Bible verses. You know the great love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13? Verse 4 says, love is kind. And verse 5 says, love is not rude. The J.B. Phillips translation translates that, love has good manners. Now you think about that a minute. You know, that's not something that sometimes we talk about when we preach on this love chapter. But love has good manners. Love is not rude. I mean, love is saying please and thank you and excuse me. That's good manners, isn't it? Do we still teach that? Do parents still teach that to their children? You know, in the South, my wife grew up with yes, sir, and no, sir, and yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am. Now, I'm never sure. We lived in Louisville 6 years, and I'm never quite sure is we're kind of in the central to north part of Kentucky if we're in the South or not. Now, some people say yes, and some no. I always thought anything south of the Ohio River was the South, okay? But did you learn that growing up? I mean, just respectful talk. And you know some of the talk that I hear sometimes today with teenagers and young people talking to their parents, it is so disrespectful. It is so rude. Some of the talk that I hear with husbands and wives is so embarrassing. I mean, I'm embarrassed to hear sometimes the way that they would talk to one another and that it is crude and all of that. Well, love is not rude or crude. Love has good manners. It is considerate of your spouse. Now, guys, I hate to tell you this, but we're some of the worst offenders. And you say, how do you know that? Well, the Holy Spirit in 1 Peter 3:7 says, husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wife. Now, why do you suppose he put that on us men? Do you suppose it may be that our wives are typically a little bit more considerate and a little bit more emotional and have a little bit more feeling and are a little bit more in touch with their feelings and other people's feelings? That maybe you suppose God actually made women different than men? What a concept, huh, in our society today. And that maybe women naturally are a little bit more considerate. And maybe some of us guys, if we're not careful, we're just rushing ahead, not considering the feelings and paying attention to other people's feelings. He says, live considerate or be considerate with your wife. And so we need to work at doing that. You know what that means? It means to think about how she feels. What makes her happy? What makes her sad? What she likes? What she doesn't like? Now, notice it says, your wife. Now, I know we make jokes about women and about husbands, and we say, oh, women this or men this. But you know, not all wives are like my wife. And my wife may not be like your wife. You know, my wife likes vanilla ice cream. Now, see, I thought all women like, now she likes chocolate okay. But if she's got her pick, and we're going to get one ice cream, and there's one, she likes vanilla, especially Breyer's Vanilla Bean. Some of you like that too. That's what she likes. Now, if she tells me to go pick what I want, I'm going to get Rocky Road, or I'm going to get Dutch chocolate, or I'm going to get the triple chocolate. I mean, anything chocolate. See? But not all women maybe like that. So there are just a lot of things that may be different about your wife. And the Bible says to us that we live in consideration. One version says understandingly with your wife. Love is considerate of feelings. You know, I came across this years ago. It's a little dated, but I like it. I'll read it to you. It's by my favorite author, Anonymous. Y'all seen him? He writes a lot of stuff. He used to write in church bulletins. Sometimes he just calls himself Anon. Okay? And he writes this, the 5 stages of a married cold. First year, baby darling, I'm worried about that sniffle you have, and so I've called the paramedics to rush you over to the hospital for a checkup and a week of rest. I know you don't like hospital food, so I'm having the meals brought in. Year 2. Sweetheart, I don't like the sound of that cough. I've arranged for Dr. Johnson to make a house call. Let me tuck you in bed. Year 3. You look like you got a fever. Why don't you drive yourself over to the med stop and get some medicine? I'll watch the kids. Oh, it gets better. Year 4. Now look, be sensible. After you've fed and bathed the kids and washed the dishes, you really ought to go to bed. Year 5. For Pete's sake, do you have to cough so loud? I can hardly hear the TV. Would you mind going into the other room while their show is on? You sound like a barking dog. Well, that just shows, and maybe some of you, I see some of you smiling, that I can see your smiles. Feel the same way. In fact, one guy, I get this here as an addendum. A man said, in the first year my wife used to bring me my slippers and the dog came barking. Now the dog brings me my slippers and my wife comes barking. So things sometimes change. But why? Why do they have to change? Maybe it's because we're not being considerate in our relationship. Number 4 is compromise during conflict. 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 5 says, love doesn't demand its own way. Now, I don't know if we have any young married couples here tonight. I thought I might have saw 2 or 3 this morning. Either they were unmarried or very young married. And if you're unmarried, I don't want to burst your bubble on this. Okay, if you're unmarried. All marriages have conflict. I know that's a huge shock. And if you're engaged or you're thinking about getting, you think, oh no, with my sweetheart, we would never have any conflict. Well, I'm here to tell you all marriages have conflict. Robert Jackson used to tell about this guy taking his son. They went to hear a preacher, and he's preaching on marriage. And he said, my wife and I have been married for 50 years and never had a cross word. They were going home, and the father said, the son said, well, what'd you think about that sermon tonight? He said, Dad, I want to go back tomorrow night and hear that lying preacher. So we've been married 52 years. We've had a cross word at least twice in 52 years or more. Marriage has conflict. No matter how much you love your mate, there are going to be some things with which you disagree. And if you don't learn to compromise on some things, then you're going to have a relationship problem. Love doesn't demand its own way. Love learns to compromise. What about vacations? Where you're going to go, what you're going to do, how much you're going to spend. What about visiting relatives? What holidays that you're going to visit, which relatives, and how long you're going to stay. What about how you spend your money and your budget? How you're going to spend your leisure time, your recreation, how you're going to raise your children. I mean, there's so many things that unless you take some forget counseling, most couples are never going to talk about. And they get married, and all of a sudden, they face it. True story. That Gary Smalley tells the story, one of his video series, about the young couple that got married. They were so much in love. They went away, and they had a great wedding. Everything went perfect, believe it or not. They went away and had a tremendous honeymoon. They come back off of their honeymoon, and their first night together, they wake up the next morning. He kind of wakes up, he thinks first, and he's laying there thinking, I wonder what she's going to fix me for breakfast. And she wakes up and doesn't know he's awake, and she's laying there thinking, I wonder what he's going to fix me for breakfast. And you see, what happened was that in his household, his mother always fixed breakfast. But in her household, her dad always got up and fixed breakfast. Somehow that had never come out in any discussion of whether there's marriage. But they both came in it with an assumption that the other was going to fix the breakfast. A small thing in one way, but not so small if you're hungry for breakfast and you're, well, why aren't you fixing? Well, my dad, well, my mom. And then pretty soon you're into it if you're not careful. Someone said that more marriages die from inflexibility than from alcoholism, abuse, or adultery. I don't know if that's true or not, or if that can be quantified and proven, but I don't doubt it just based on my experience in dealing with people. Learn to compromise during conflict. Secret number 5 is courtship after marriage. Now, Smalley in his series talks about men and women this way. He says that men are hunters and achievement-oriented. They're goal-directed. A man may decide, although he jokingly says no man ever decides he wants to get married, but if he does decide he wants to get married, he woos a woman, romances a woman, and they get married. Subconsciously, Smalley says, a man thinks, mission accomplished. Now my next goal is to provide for this woman. And so gradually, over a period of weeks and months and years, the romance goes out of marriage. Another part of the problem is that we see each other at the very worst time of day, unshaven, unkempt, on the run, tired, emotionally drained. What does the Bible say about this? Well, just a couple verses. Ecclesiastes 9:9 says, live joyfully with your wife, whom you love all the days of your life. And then Proverbs 15:18 and 19 says, rejoice with the wife of your youth and always be enraptured with her love. You know, guys, that kind of sounds like romance and marriage. Now, in case you question those two simple verses, just read the Song of Solomon sometime. Just get the Song of Solomon out and read this. about romance and about love. I mean, it's all right there. And it's actually pretty graphic, isn't it, in the Song of Solomon. And so the idea of courtship after marriage. Let me read you. I didn't put this on the PowerPoint. I thought I did, but it didn't. But if you want to read with me, or if you just want to listen, that's fine. Is 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And the Apostle Paul is writing the church of Corinth. Apparently, he's answering some questions that they had asked about marriage. And he says, concerning the things of verse 1, of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, there's an awful lot we could say about that, but I'll leave that for your further discussion and thought and consideration. But those 5 verses, ladies and gentlemen, men and women, are in the Bible for a purpose and for a reason. And that speaks to me and says courtship after marriage, romance after marriage. That's one of the big secrets to a satisfying marriage. Number 6, Christ as the center of your relationship. Christ gives you the power to be able to do everything else. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her. Or over in the book of Titus in chapter 2, he says, admonish young women to love their husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. One version says to teach the young women to love their husbands. You mean you have to learn to love your husband? Now, some of the wives may say, yes, I've got to learn to love him. Well, that may be the case. But I'm saying that when you follow what the Bible says, and Christ is the center of your relationship, then that gives you the power to do everything else you need to do. It helps you with communication and consideration and compromise and courtship and commitment. But without Christ, you lack the staying power to be able to accomplish these things. One writer put it like this: when human love wears out, divine love conquers. One of the greatest things that you can do in your marriage is to put Christ in the very center of it. Because Christ provides the greatest example. That Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. Sometimes the question is asked, and I've heard this asked through the years, man, do you love your wife enough to die for her? Well, how many times are we ever called upon to do that? I mean, do we, and I've heard this illustration, well, what if someone came in here with a machine gun and I'll shoot one person in every family? How many of you men would step up and say, let it be, don't shoot my wife and don't shoot my children? As far as I know, that's never happened. Now, I know we've had some violence, but as far as picking someone out, I don't know it's ever happened. So that's not really the question, men. Would you die for your wife? We might ask the question, would you live for your wife as Christ lived and loved for the church? Would you love your wife as Christ loved the church? And live in a way that you might do the kinds of things that we are talking about. Jesus said that he would never leave us or forsake us, regardless of what happens in our home, regardless of the problems we face or the challenges that we may encounter. He will supply help for your home and hope for your soul. He's gone to prepare us a heavenly home. And that this home is just a foretaste. When you have a Christian home and you have a happy, satisfying, fulfilled marriage, you see, that's just a foretaste of what heaven's going to be like. That's why Christ must be at the very center of your relationship. And of course you do that, as we talked about this morning, by being a believer, by being a Christian, by allowing the commitment your home, by allowing the commitment to Him in your home to revolve around Him, to make Him number one above everything else. And then in everything you do, as Paul said in Philippians 2 and verse 5, to have the mind of Christ. Well, you know what? I look at the clock on the wall, and I don't think I got time for number 7. Come back tomorrow night for number 7. In fact, number 7 is so important, we're just going to take the whole lesson tomorrow night, and we're going to talk about number 7. You can go ahead and turn your hymn books to the number suggested if you like. We'll sing the song of invitation, encouragement in just a moment. And if you owe a duty to God in some way, and we can serve you and help you in being what you need to be in your home and in your relationship with Christ, we'd love to do that. I want to close with one last story. It's a true story. And it's written by Laura Palmer. And she said, don't waste today regretting yesterday instead of making a memory for tomorrow. And then she tells a story that Ann Wells printed in the LA Times several years ago. And the story goes like this, true story. Ann says, my brother-in-law opened the bottom drawer of my sister's bureau and lifted out a tissue-wrapped package. This is not a slip, he said. This is lingerie. He discarded the tissue and handed me the slip. It was exquisite, silk, handmade, trimmed with a cobweb of lace. The price tag with an astronomical figure on it was still attached. Jan bought this the first time we went to New York, at least 8 or 9 years ago. She never wore it. She said she was saving it for a special occasion. I guess this is the occasion. He took the slip from me and put it on the bed with the other clothes we were taking to the mortician. His hands lingered on the soft material for a moment. Then he slammed the dresser drawers shut, and he turned to me and said, don't ever save anything for a special occasion. Every day you're alive is a special occasion. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I come to you today to say today is your day. It is the day the Lord has given you, the day to enjoy being with your husband or with your wife or with your children or with your parents. Live it, love it, enjoy it, make it a special day. Make it his day, make it her day. But remember this, it's the only day that you have. As we close our service tonight, we sing a song of invitation and encouragement. If we can serve you, would you come right now as we stand and sing?